November 11, 1940, began as an unremarkable late autumn day across Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Iowa. Overcast skies stretched from the Dakotas to Lake Michigan, with temperatures holding in the mid-30s Fahrenheit. Light rain fell intermittently over Minneapolis and St. Paul. The ground remained unfrozen. Farmers worked fields that had not yet hardened. Commuters drove through wet streets on their way to Armistice Day observances. The Great Lakes carried their usual traffic. Freighters moved iron ore, coal, and grain between Duluth, Superior, and lower ports. Lake Superior's water temperature held near 40 degrees. Navigation season was winding down but not yet finished. Shore facilities operated normally. No weather warnings suggested interruption. Roads throughout the region carried standard traffic. Highway departments had not positioned snowplows or salt trucks. Rail lines ran on regular schedules. Communication systems functioned without strain. The infrastructure of the upper Midwest operated as it did on any November weekday, calibrated for late fall conditions rather than winter. Meteorological expectations aligned with historical patterns. November storms were not unusual, but severe winter weather typically arrived in December. The previous days had brought rain and moderate temperatures. Nothing in the public forecast suggested significant change. The region prepared for Armistice Day ceremonies, not for blizzard conditions. By mid-morning, the rain continued. Visibility remained adequate for travel. Lake shipping proceeded. The transition from autumn to winter seemed weeks away. A low-pressure system had been tracking eastward across the Central Plains for 2 days. On November 10, it moved through Nebraska and South Dakota, bringing rain to areas west of the Mississippi River. The system's central pressure was falling rapidly, intensifying as it moved. Weather stations recorded pressure drops of several millibars per hour, indicating strengthening circulation. Simultaneously, a mass of Arctic air had broken away from the polar region and was pushing south through Canada. The cold front advanced faster than seasonal norms. Surface temperatures behind the front dropped into the teens and single digits Fahrenheit. The descending cold air created a steep temperature gradient across the northern plains. By the morning of November 11, the low-pressure center was positioned over western Minnesota and continuing to deepen. The Arctic front approached from the northwest. The two systems were converging. Warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico was being drawn northward ahead of the low, colliding with the advancing cold mass. The atmospheric setup created conditions for rapid intensification. Weather forecasting in 1940 relied on surface observations transmitted by telegraph and telephone. Upper air data was limited. Weather balloons and radiosondes provided some information, but coverage was sparse across the plains and upper Midwest. Meteorologists lacked satellite imagery, radar, and computer modeling. The speed and intensity of the system's development outpaced the observational network's ability to track it in real time. As the low deepened, pressure gradients tightened. Wind speeds increased. The collision between warm and cold air masses created instability. The system was organizing into a rapidly intensifying extratropical cyclone, but forecasters had insufficient data to predict its full severity or the speed of the temperature collapse that was about to occur. Around midday on November 11, the Arctic front reached the western edge of Minnesota. The temperature in Fargo, North Dakota, dropped from 35 degrees F to 15 degrees F in less than 3 hours. The rain that had been falling across the region began to change character. In southwestern Minnesota, precipitation transitioned from liquid to solid within minutes. Snow began falling heavily. The temperature collapse moved eastward. At St. Paul, the thermometer read 33 degrees F at noon. By 2:00 p.m., it had fallen to 18 degrees F. Rain turned to snow with remarkable abruptness. Snowflakes were large and wet initially, then became smaller and drier as the cold intensified. Snowfall rates reached 2 to 3 inches per hour in some locations. Wind speeds increased as the pressure gradient steepened. Sustained winds of 40 to 50 miles per hour developed across southern Minnesota and northern Iowa. Gusts exceeded 60 miles per hour. The combination of heavy snow and high wind created blizzard conditions. Visibility dropped below a quarter mile, then to near zero in many areas. Whiteout conditions set in. The storm's advance was not gradual. Communities experienced the transition from rain to blizzard in less than an hour. Roads that had been wet became snow-covered and then obliterated by drifting. The temperature continued falling through the afternoon. By evening, readings in the teens were common across southern Minnesota and Wisconsin. Wind chill values dropped below 0 Fahrenheit. Snowfall totals accumulated rapidly. Minneapolis recorded 16 inches in 24 hours. Collegeville, Minnesota, measured 18 inches. Duluth received nearly 2 feet. The snow was fine and powdery, easily lifted by the wind. Drifts formed against buildings, vehicles, and fences, some reaching 6 to 8 feet in height. The landscape transformed from late autumn to deep winter in the span of an afternoon. Highway traffic came to a standstill across the region by mid-afternoon. Vehicles on rural roads and state highways were immobilized by snow accumulation and zero visibility. Drivers who attempted to continue found themselves trapped in drifts or unable to discern the road from surrounding fields. Hundreds of automobiles and trucks were abandoned as occupants sought shelter in farmhouses, businesses, or remained in their vehicles. In Minneapolis and St. Paul, city streets filled with stalled cars. Streetcars stopped running as tracks became impassable. Buses could not maintain schedules. Traffic signals were obscured by blowing snow. Emergency services struggled to respond to calls. Snowplows had not been deployed in advance, and when they were dispatched, many became stuck or were unable to make progress against the accumulation rate and drifting. Rail operations were disrupted across the network. Snow drifted over tracks faster than maintenance crews could clear it. Switches froze in position, preventing trains from being routed. Locomotives stalled in drifts. Passenger trains were stranded between stations. The Milwaukee Roads Hiawatha, traveling between Chicago and the Twin Cities, became stuck near Red Wing, Minnesota, with passengers aboard. Freight trains halted on sidings and main lines. The rail system, critical for moving goods and people, ceased functioning. On the Great Lakes, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Wind speeds over Lake Michigan and Lake Superior reached hurricane force, with sustained winds of 70 miles per hour and gusts higher. Wave heights exceeded 20 feet. Temperatures dropped rapidly, causing spray to freeze on ship superstructures. Ice accumulation affected stability. Several vessels issued distress calls. The Armistice Day storm struck during a period when lake shipping was still active. Multiple freighters foundered or were driven aground. The Novadoc sank on Lake Michigan. The Anna C. Minch and the William B. Davock were lost on Lake Michigan with all hands. Rescue operations were hindered by the storm's intensity. Lifeboats and Coast Guard cutters struggled in the heavy seas and blinding snow. As evening arrived on November 11, temperatures continued their descent. Readings fell into the single digits Fahrenheit across much of Minnesota and Wisconsin. Wind chill values dropped to 30 and 40 below zero. The cold was sudden and severe, arriving without the gradual seasonal transition that typically allowed infrastructure and residents to prepare. Power lines began failing under the combined load of ice accumulation and high winds. Poles snapped. Lines went down. Electrical service was interrupted in both urban and rural areas. Homes and businesses lost heating at the onset of extreme cold. Buildings not yet winterized lost heat rapidly. Furnaces that relied on electricity could not operate. Coal and wood heating systems continued to function, but supplies were not always accessible due to transportation failures. Telephone and telegraph lines also failed. Communication between towns and cities was disrupted. Rural areas became isolated. Emergency services could not coordinate effectively. Families stranded on highways or in vehicles on rural roads had no way to call for help. The network that connected the region fractured. In rural communities, farms and homesteads were cut off. Livestock were exposed to the sudden cold and wind. Barns provided some shelter, but animals in fields had little protection. Farmers attempting to reach livestock or secure structures faced life-threatening conditions. Visibility was near zero. Wind chill made prolonged exposure fatal. Some individuals became disoriented and were unable to find their way back to shelter. Hospitals in larger cities received patients suffering from hypothermia and frostbite, but transportation difficulties delayed arrivals. Ambulances could not navigate streets or highways. People trapped in vehicles or attempting to walk to safety endured hours in sub-zero wind chills. The infrastructure designed for late autumn could not respond to winter emergency conditions. Urban areas faced shortages. Food deliveries were halted. Milk trucks could not reach dairies or customers. Grocery inventories could not be restocked. Coal deliveries for heating were delayed. The supply chains that sustained daily life were interrupted. The region entered a state of functional isolation, with movement and communication severely restricted. By November 12, the storm's intensity began to diminish. Snowfall rates decreased. Wind speeds dropped, though gusts still exceeded 30 miles per hour in some areas. Temperatures remained below freezing, with daytime highs in the teens. The immediate crisis of the storm transitioned to the challenge of recovery under persistent cold. Snow removal operations began where equipment could be mobilized. State highway departments deployed plows, but the volume of snow and extent of drifting required days of continuous work. Main highways were prioritized. Rural roads remained blocked. Plows worked to create single lanes, pushing snow into berms that lined the cleared paths. Engines struggled in the extreme cold. Hydraulic systems froze. Operators worked in shifts, but progress was slow. Railroads assigned crews to clear tracks and free stranded trains. Snowplows mounted on locomotives pushed through drifts. Track walkers inspected lines for damage. Switches were cleared manually, heated to restore function. Freight trains began moving again on major routes, but branch lines remained closed. Passenger service resumed gradually. The passengers of the stranded Hiawatha were eventually evacuated and transported by other means. On the Great Lakes, the search for missing vessels and survivors continued as conditions allowed. Coast Guard cutters and commercial ships searched the waters where distress calls had originated. Wreckage was located. Bodies were recovered. The full toll of the storm on lake shipping emerged over subsequent days. Navigation was suspended as ice began forming on the upper lakes. Power restoration required extensive repair work. Utility crews worked to replace poles and restring lines. Progress was hindered by snow depth, continued cold, and access difficulties. Some areas remained without electricity for a week. Residents relied on alternative heating methods. Communities organized to check on isolated households and provide assistance where possible. Communication networks were gradually restored. Telephone and telegraph lines were repaired. The flow of information resumed, allowing coordination of relief efforts. News of the storm's full impact reached the wider public. The scale of disruption and loss became clear. The recovery phase extended through mid-November. Snow compacted by wind and cold resisted removal. Temperatures remained below normal. The region remained in winter conditions. The rapid transition had overwhelmed response capacity. Restoring normal operations required sustained effort under adverse conditions. The storm moved east on November 12, bringing snow and wind to the Great Lakes region and eventually losing intensity as it tracked toward the Atlantic. By November 13, high pressure began building over the upper Midwest, bringing clear skies but continued cold. Temperatures slowly moderated toward seasonal norms over the following week. The Armistice Day Blizzard resulted in 154 documented deaths across Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Iowa. Casualties included individuals stranded in vehicles, people caught outdoors during the storm's onset, sailors lost on the Great Lakes, and farmers who succumbed to exposure. Duck hunters on the Mississippi River were particularly affected, as many were in small boats when the storm struck, unable to reach shore before conditions became lethal. Economic losses were substantial. Lake shipping companies lost vessels and cargo, insurance claims mounted, transportation disruptions interrupted commerce and production. Agriculture suffered livestock losses. The cost of infrastructure repair and snow removal strained municipal and state budgets. The storm's economic impact rippled through the regional economy for months. The event prompted changes in meteorological practice and public safety infrastructure. The U.S. Weather Bureau reviewed its forecasting procedures and observational networks. The storm demonstrated the need for improved data collection, particularly upper air measurements, and more frequent reporting from remote areas. Investments were made in expanding the network of weather stations and improving communication of forecast information to the public and emergency services. State and local governments revised winter preparedness plans. Snow removal equipment was increased. Stockpiles of road salt and sand were established earlier in the season. Public awareness campaigns emphasized the dangers of early-season storms. The assumption that severe winter weather would not arrive until December was abandoned. The Great Lakes maritime community implemented changes to shipping schedules and vessel operations. The traditional end of the navigation season was reconsidered. Weather monitoring for ships was enhanced. Safety equipment and cold weather survival training became standard. The storm's legacy was a recognition that winter could arrive without warning, and that systems calibrated for gradual seasonal transitions could fail when conditions changed rapidly. The Armistice Day Blizzard of 1940 redefined the region's understanding of weather risk. Preparation for severe winter weather became a late autumn priority. The storm that arrived in hours left changes that endured for decades.